So to help set expectations in the beginning, I did not create a new set of lecture notes for this. I'm going off of the very same material that was already available to you from this little readme perspective to today for taking on the take-home guide. The reason I'm doing that is because I figured it would be more useful, instead of trying to create a whole other set of lecture notes, to actually walk through one of my take-homes that I had before joining here. It's actually a pretty good take-home. I'm very happy with it. But it'll be a good example of use specificity to bring generality to the topic. Also, my last hair tie broke, which is why I keep trying to use pens. So if my hair is flailing around, it's not because of lack of respect for all of you. This is my last now. Oh, sorry. This is just me. Okay. So our objectives for this hour or so, plus or minus, some amount of time, hopefully minus, are to talk about developing a general strategy for time boxing take-homes. Why is that a problem? Well, chances are you're going to be busy. But busy with what? Other take-homes, other applications, interviews, having a life, possibly even having a job while you're searching for another job, which sometimes happens in data science. We're like, oh, this first stuff's going to be great, and then it's not. But it's okay. Once you get that first job, it'll be much easier to get the next data science job. Always the case. Okay, so aside from time boxing, which I've got some neat tips here. Other things you want to be able to do is identify deliverables and how to over-deliver properly, which means you're going to have to know who your audience is, and also have a general but flexible strategy for taking on take-homes, which is why we're here. We want to be able to look at a take-home set of problems and go, okay, what's my overall strategy so I don't pour too much of my brain into this? I just want to demonstrate my abilities, have a good way of presenting myself to the appropriate people. We can literally create a presentation that would be readily readable. And hopefully use that to get to the next stage, usually the in-person interview stage. Sometimes they can happen a little bit out of order. Okay, but first off, I keep mentioning the word take-homes. Do people know what a take-home is? In fact, what I want to see is who has never seen a take-home or know what a take-home is? If you've never seen one, or cool. Okay. So take-homes, I like to think of as little mini case studies that are brought to you by the company themselves. Sometimes the take-home is literally just one of their previous projects that's truncated down. It means you're often using real data from the company, live data. Sometimes they even make you sign NDAs just to be able to do the take-home because they don't want you sharing that information for any number of reasons. Other times, take-homes are just completely made up. And that means sometimes they'll purposefully hide in data, little snafus, little things that you might want to pay attention for, like really weird imputations for what might have been missing data, so that way they know that you looked at the data before you started throwing models at it. So keep that in mind in general, like just get to know what kind of data that it is that you're looking at. But in general, take-homes are mini projects. So because they're mini projects, that often means that the level of rigor that they're going to want from you is going to be moderate. They're not going to expect you to spend necessarily, even if they give you something like, send this back in 48 hours. They'll often tell you specifically, try to do this in 6 hours, in 8 hours, in 12 hours, in 2 hours. And they really want to do that because, as you would imagine, with any project, you can spend endless amounts of time doing it, and it might not be a good demonstration of what you're capable of doing in that time. It's kind of obvious. But the other added benefit of that is, since you're busy, really pay attention to that and think, okay, if I time box somewhere around that range for this take-home, I can work on other stuff too. This doesn't have to take over my whole life. And that's kind of nice to know that there's going to be an endpoint for each of these little sub-projects. So, walking through this a little bit more. I often agree with this. Take-homes can be fun. That's certainly subjective, but because it's a little bit more than just sending in a resume and writing a nice bunch of stuff about yourself and why you're qualified, there's an opportunity to actually flex your data science muscles that you've all been developing for the last 3 months. The kind of things you'll often see in a take-home, mention the data, usually, most of the time. I actually haven't run into any personal situations where they didn't offer me some form of data to work with. The worst that I've seen before getting a take-home was just general questions and answers before they even sent me the take-home. Time limits, I mentioned this before. They will ask you to spend a specific amount of time on the project, and I will dig into that in a second because I actually like playing around with these time limits. Presentations. This one actually is, in my opinion, just like with your capstones, in some ways, as important or more important than the work that you did to create the presentation. Because if you can't explain what you did and justify it, they won't care. You can be brilliant. You can spend the entire time to the last second coming up with the most pristine model with this beautiful rock curve. But if you can't explain what the rock curve is doing, and they don't know what a rock curve is, you've done nothing for them. They don't understand your brilliance. They understand the brilliance. Thank you. Ambiguity. Depending on how you react to right or wrong answers and scenarios, you may, I don't know. When they say ambiguity, I often think of this as you get to define for yourself, assuming that you've asked questions and they didn't clarify things more for you. In part, they're asking you to define the boundaries of your problem. You have a general question, but you get to make some specifications. You get to say, well, I'm assuming this, so now I have a framework to work in. And the reason they might want specifically to have this is to see, can you think like a data scientist when you're dealing with people who maybe don't? So, again, the goals of take-homes are to measure some things about you. It's a validation method. It's not perfect. None of these are. But they do want to check things like your ability to present, whether they want it in sometimes a Jupyter notebook. It's rare, but it's becoming more common. Often slides, most often slides, honestly, or PDFs. They want to be able to see that you can be clear about your process and what your results were. They want to make sure that you actually followed along with the time management, that it's believable that you did the work in that amount of time and you didn't spend 3 days straight coming up with the most pristine version of the project. That you have the kinds of goals that are oriented with the company. So yes, you will have to do a little bit of research for that company before you get started on the take-home. Domain expertise, if you have it. Hopefully, if you don't, it's okay to look up stuff. Know that you're not a domain expert. That's okay. You don't have to limit yourself to just the tools we've shown you. They want to know that you can cooperate under ambiguity and whether or not you utilize best practices in your work. And that often can mean they might ask you to submit your code. Doesn't always happen. Often I'll submit my code anyway, just in case. And by submit my code, I often mean, let's see, where did I put it? Yeah. So instead of a Jupyter notebook, actually this is before I even used code. I created a nice little pie file that you could run top to bottom that also included in comments all of the results that I found. And each little bit, just like one of the solutions for your sprints, answers a specific question that was asked. So in the, let's see. Those are my full presentation. Sorry, 1 second. So, what are the take-homes from a company that I won't name? It was pretty simple. They said, the attached data set, that's this, has actual sales from that company that date back to 2012, and there's some information from stuff that happened before 2012, and they wanted me to find some specific business insights. So, before I even took this on, I wanted to know a little bit more about who it was that I was trying to answer these questions for. So I did a little bit of digging. I found out that the company had a data analytics team that was primarily filled with people who were self-trained data scientists. That happens a lot in the field. You'll find a lot of people who used to be coders and had to learn some analysis on the job and kept developing it. And they have a lot of knowledge, but they'll have gaps that you can fill, which is why they're hiring you. So with that, knowing that, I looked at these questions and was like, okay, these are clear business analytical questions. I wonder where my extra value add can be. But first and foremost, before I started thinking too deeply about that, I just needed to make sure, could I answer these 6 questions from that data? How many unique customers purchased in 2012? What is the breakdown of purchases by country? Percentage of these customers that are new customers? That's really important in terms of, 1, like knowing the growth of your company, and 2, trying to figure out trends. What does the seasonality over the year look like? That's a term that you may or may not have heard. This is literally to say things change over time repeatedly, consistently. Can we detect that? Which product category brings in the most revenue? That is a vague, ambiguous question. So I came up with multiple possible interpretations for this and answered all of them. And which product category customer is the most valuable? Same thing. So already this covers the scope of ambiguity, specificity, and making sure I already knew what the audience was. Okay, so yes.
So the point of the TakeHome is to showcase your visualization, like those kinds of skills. Because it seems like the coding is no longer a priority at this point.
Yeah.
You've done your Python.
I'll argue that it depends on your audience. Some teams really want to see that you have at least clear and discernible code. They don't expect you to have it like completely restructured and to be most efficient. They just want to see that you can actually do it yourself and that it's not a complete mess. We're going to get into that a little bit later. Oops. But the reason for that is, unlike with your capstones, for example, you did this with your case studies. You work together in teams. And if you were pretty lax on your code, you started hard coding things that didn't need to get hard coded. You started showing some red flag signs. If someone just perusing through the code without looking too deeply, notice those red flags. That's enough of an anti-validation to know maybe this person isn't for us. So I'm not saying make perfect code, but organize it enough so that if you look at it a month later, you know what's going on. But yes, visualizations are very important. So not necessarily the most pretty, but the most clear. This particular job actually was asking me if I had any expertise in visualization. I admitted I didn't, but I could work on it. What I did know was how to, what sorts of ways to visualize these things, not the specific technologies. So like, do I want to use bar graphs? Do I want to be able to show this as something that changes over time? Those sorts of things we already have here. I am confident that all of you would be able to do this sort of take home the same way, at least similarly as how I did. So, before we go back into the Crisp DM, I want to give you a little bit of advice that was shared to me by a former instructor. A lot of you actually saw Darren talk, so I can actually name him by name. So Darren Reeder said, for any take-home, they will give you an amount of time. Now, regardless of what your current skill set is, treat that time like this is the amount of time if I were already proficient in all of the things required to do this project, not be an expert in it, but proficient enough. If I were proficient enough, what could I accomplish in that time? That means you have some small snafus. You forgot how to use matplotlib. You don't remember exactly how to switch things into the proper date time. You have a few issues here and there, just things you forgot, but that you would know if you practiced them. Go ahead and give yourself a little bit of leeway. If that takes you an extra 2 hours, that's okay. You're still time boxing in a way that's not getting in your way, but it would still better represent what you could do on the job. It's a little bit of a cheat, I'll admit it. But the thing is, that cheat is going to, in some ways, better represent a forecast of how you'll perform in the future. So if you were to do the same kind of take-home, different data, slightly different questions, again, you could do it in the time allotted. So go ahead and treat this like really good practice for yourself. Every single one of these interview and application processes, I mentioned this before, Will, is like stochastic gradient descent. You make some mistakes, you learn, you get better for the next one. But imagine that you're already in the future where you're kicking ass. Okay, so as always, we want to be able to do something like the Crisp DM, which, oh my gosh, I always forget what it stands for. But it's our general notion of producing a minimum viable product as soon as possible in such a way that we can keep iterating on it and improving it. This is still true, and it's especially true on take-home because of this time boxing. So please, please, please focus on answering the questions that were asked of you as quickly as possible, and then develop on it. So how did that look for me? Well, same questions, I just put that on the slide. I straight up just answered the initial questions. I identified the deliverables, which were answer those questions. So in terms of answering the first two questions, who are the unique customers? I just went ahead and checked to see who they were, or rather where they're from. And I noticed that the vast majority of them for this company were from the US. They do international work too, but I had to log scale just to be able to visualize more evenly across all these different other countries. And that just was a helpful little business insight for me personally, and the company able to do that. What percent of those customers were new? Well, we were actually able to figure that out here. 71% of the customers were new in 2012, which meant they wanted me to look at one of their biggest growth periods in their history. So that got me a little bit thinking about maybe they're trying to poke at, can we find trends from the past that were still helpful for this very different looking present? 2012 being present. More clues as to what they were interested in. They were asking about things like seasonality. Now, before I did too deep into this, I do want to show you what the data looked like. It was an Excel spreadsheet. It made me a little bit grumpy. Why? Because Excel spreadsheets are fully importable back into Python. It's just a pain to make sure that you do it right. So you'll notice in my code, whoop, yep, pandas is my friend. Pandas will almost always be your friend during take-homes unless they give you big data. And I just went ahead and figured out, this is actually something that took me way longer than I anticipated. It took me actually like 30 minutes, so I actually shaved that off of my take-home time. How to properly read Excel spreadsheets with the appropriate columns. The data is split up on one sheet by columns. No good data scientist would say it like this, but like I mentioned, the people who I would have been working for, self-taught data scientists. They were primarily early on in Excel, and were just developing their ability to do data science in Python. Very convenient. But that's in the stage that they were in 2012. So, went ahead, continue that process, did all that analysis, but actually let's go back to the data, or the results. So, when I was looking at this, I noticed that they gave and asked about seasonality, but they had two types of data. One which was just purchases for 2012. And another about new customers coming in from 2010 to 2012. And they wanted to ask about seasonality. Seasonality is something that occurs over the course of usually months, most often years, because seasons. So they wanted me to figure out some sort of relationship between the sales here. You'll notice the spike in December of 2012. And compare that to something that occurred over many days, actually all the way back to 2009. And you'll notice just by looking at it that there's this thing called, that looks pretty seasonal, that keeps happening in December. So just visually, that's enough. You can already say I've detected the seasonality. Most of the sales seem to happen here in December, but it was strongly associated to first-time purchases that kept happening around that December period, which I mentioned not in this presentation, but I got to bring it into the company and say, I have noticed that most of your sales come from first-time customers. And they like that. That wasn't a specific question that they were asking for. Every little thing that you tease out from your data as you're looking through it is something that you might be able to hold on to and deliver to them to demonstrate, yes, not only did I answer your question, I got a little bit more business insight from this. So, found the seasonality. I'll get to that in a little bit. And I also answered the other relevant questions. And I mentioned before, I needed to scope the question because of ambiguity. They wanted to know things like, what were the highest revenue types of items? And they didn't specify per item, they didn't specify per category, so I did both. And I found that, for example, by total revenue, that's money in, not net gain, this thing that was labeled items B having produced the most sales. Cool, great, most revenue. But per item sold, dramatically, whatever it is here in category E from this company that they sold, made up over 90% of, or was, sorry, per item was that much bigger than the revenue per item of any of the other items sold. Which was, again, not something they specifically asked for, but sorts of analytics that you can figure out. You might be able to say things like, we might also seek to increase sales of product E, which may produce a higher return on investment, but I would need to get a little bit more information before I feel confident about making business suggestions. If I had to be real, this slide was one of the reasons I got brought in for the interviews. And something very similar, revenue by product per customer. So it's not just did you answer the questions, did you come up with an understanding from those answers that you state clearly that could provide business insights. And, okay, I'll get back to this in a bit. All right. Actually, already talked about planning your approach, but let's walk through this anyway. So, realistically with these things, they'll give you some deadlines, but those deadlines will often be days out in advance. They won't actually give you, do this in 12 hours and send it immediately in 12 hours. They'll just say, on our system, we'll give it to you 2 weeks in advance, take only this much time. And I've already given you some advice about how to maybe use that time a little bit more generously for yourself. During that time, of course, you're going to have to worry about making sure you have your deliverables met, that you're able to follow this VM process. But really what I want to skip straight to is this. Here's an example of a 3-hour project. Spend not too much time on EDA. So for a 3-hour project, maybe 30 minutes, max 1 hour of your time, if the data is particularly messy or confusing. But immediately move from there to, if it's appropriate, building a model. If it's appropriate, doing grid searching. If it's appropriate, feature engineering. And the rest of the time, evaluating that model here. Plus a good chunk of time. Notice 1 hour for making the presentation. Throughout my code, you'll see me constantly creating figures and saving them, even if I didn't end up using them. I just made that a habit. And that's something you'll probably want to do too. So while you're in the process of using your Jupyter notebook, and you're doing all these plots, save the plots. Name them well. So that way you'll know what you're looking at later. So these are the sorts of good habits that will only make you a better data scientist, but will continually make it easier for you to do this in the allocated time. And yep, chances are things will change. You have to be flexible. Bugs can happen. You'll realize the data is not what you expected it to be. But yeah, try to stick to that time. So I have a question for you. Let's say that you were asked to come up with a predictive model by someone who's hiring their first data scientist. It could be a startup. And they want you to be able to predict pricing based off of, here's some customer data from previous purchases. What kind of models do you think you should throw at that problem first? If any. Sorry? Yes, well, definitely a regression of some kind because you're predicting a price, for example. What kind of regression? Linear. I'm hearing linear. Anyone else got any other strong ones that they're for?
It depends a bit on what features you see. If the feature makes sense, I will go with linear. If the bunch of stuff doesn't make sense, I will go with different.
Yeah, that's actually the process we're going to talk about. But first and foremost, you always want to start with the simplest model possible and one that's explicable, which means, depending on the problem, either do a linear regression or do a logistic regression. Often you'll find that the features are not actually best the current way they are for linear regression. That's okay. Do it anyway. Why would I say that?
If you're only interested in prediction, not inference, is it still fine for the features to not be linear and still use linear?
In a take-home, it's unlikely that they're just going to say, give me the highest score. But if you, in general, if you're more interested in more of an accurate prediction, then you probably want a more flexible model than a linear regression. But we choose linear logistic regressors because they are what we say over and over again, you're close to explicable. You can at least come up with a story, even if it's not a good story. It's still a story that's based on the data that you can immediately say, well, you can look at this particular feature, and as this goes up, your profits could go up by exactly, or according to this model, this much. Which leads to very immediate stories that you could build into your quote-unquote business insights. But Guido mentioned something very key here, which is in the Crisp VM world, we're not stuck with linear regression, so we noticed maybe this isn't a very good score. Even though we came up with a nice explicable story, we want to do something more. So you said random forest. I like random forest, Guido. Anyone else have a particular fondness for random forest? Think it's good? Why random forest?
That's fast.
I mean, sure. Definitely faster than boosting. I almost never do boosting for takeoffs. Very unlikely. Well, really the overnight kind of gradient boosting. You can go kind of down do boosting stuff pretty fast. Hamilton?
I beyond overfitting issues easier or harder than beyond.
Yeah. Handles overfitting or avoids overfitting rather really well. Requires minimal tuning. Just bump up the number of trees and you're pretty close to as good as it's going to get. You can always tune hyperparameters more. It's fast. You can parallelize it. And outliers. What do you mean by outliers? Yeah. So in the linear regression and logistic regression world, you may end up with some really heinous outliers that could drag your sigmoid or drag your line into their direction. But random forest, let's say that you can't quite figure out what's an outlier here, there's some weird stuff going on, is very flexible with handling outliers. Really good at it. The whole notion of having splits, like isolating the outlier and going, I'll just predict this if you show up, but otherwise everyone else is going to be covered. It is an extremely flexible model, and that's the second one I almost always recommend. So, cool. Now, my actual example, outliers, yeah. So, in a linear regression problem, you might have some sort of trend like this, and then an outlier all the way out here with respect to x1. And yeah. But a random forest will probably do something like this. And unless you have data that's all the way out here in the future, all this stuff's going to be handled well. And if you have other data that's out here, random forest will still try to figure out a way to capture this, even if it moves in this small area of your data. And I'm actually going to turn this just so there's an opportunity for people at home. Outlier up top. Random forest would be better at handling all the rest of the data and isolating the outlier. Okay, cool. So despite all of the fancy tools and tricks we gave you, you're going to be spending a lot of time on take-homes probably looking at very simple models. And then, if you have time, throwing in the strongest thing you got. Whether that means smarter feature engineering because of your domain knowledge that you've picked up. And that can help with linear regressions and logistic regressions. Whether that means using more complex models than were originally asked for, but you still are going to need to do things like explain why you chose that. Here's feature importance. If you're really, really savvy and you know that you're talking to a data scientist, you might want to use partial dependence plots to justify it by virtue of here's what it does with each of these features. Hamilton?
If you were to train a model which
Like really takes longer than a lot of time for the take-home to train, like that goes to deep learning.
Oh no, just skip those. No,
Would it be okay to say I worked on it for like an hour, then trained overnight, then went back to work on it, or would that be a violation of their?
I don't think it would be a violation of their terms. I think it would be like.
Would that be okay? Like
I wouldn't throw a tool at a problem that wasn't meant for that problem. So if, for example, you're trying to apply to a company that has really rich data on, for example, usage of electricity on the grid from people who have solar built into their house. And you're trying to find some really deep, nuanced stuff. And the company, and I'm basing this directly off of the thing that James sent earlier, wants you to work with neural nets, then do all the stuff that I mentioned before, but also say, because I know that you want me to use neural nets, let me show you what I can do. And say, I ran this overnight, I wasn't working on it personally. Otherwise, I generally say almost never use a neural net. But yeah, I think that would be fair if you can justify it. And I'm going to hammer this in again because this is something that I have issues with. Your time is important. You can still burn out during your job application process. It can happen. It happened to me before. No single application is the perfect one, and you don't need a perfect one to get a job. No single job is the perfect one. You don't have to be perfect for that job. So guard your time. Make sure that you're allocating enough for other parts of your life, including other job applications. So in terms of choosing your best methods, I gave you some tips already, but you'll notice that the problem that I was asked didn't require much more. This is almost all basic statistics. And I was like, how do I bring something a little bit more novel into this? Unfortunately for you folks, we did not cover time series. I would still love to do that with you, and I want to figure out a time this week that we can do that. But I knew of a time series tool that I could use. And you can still use this too. The lectures are available to you. The sprints are available. I made the world. But this little tool here, part of the Sorry Max package, looks at seasonality in a very distinct way. And this one was another reason I probably got into the interview. Again, the main reasons I got in after talking with them were these insights, but they wanted to know what the heck was going on here. And I was like, yes, that's exactly why I put this in here. This is above and beyond what you asked for, so I'll do it. I talked about something called autocorrelation, which is to say, take your data and just copy that data and shift it by some amount of time and see how much those data points line up with each other as shifted by 1 month, 2 months, 1 year. And this is the correlation across all of those data points as shifted compared to the original. 100%, of course, when there's no shift. And notice that 52 weeks. That is a measurable quantity that tells you how similar each year is for new customers compared to previous years. And this is just effectively, it's like the differential version of it. It shows where are these spikes happening. Boom, right around 52 is where you see the most dramatic changes. Okay. So I was confident that I could talk about it, which is why I put it in. Yes?
How is this different from using the data shift?
And then doing a correlate off of all of it?
Yeah.
It's not.
So it's just a package that does it.
It does other things too. You can find, this entire module can do more. But this particular part is literally just that time shift correlation. You're right. That's exactly it. So in other words, you can already do this, is what I'm saying. At least this part here, with the knowledge that you have.
Yeah.
Oh, right. So this part is also a little bit non-intuitive, at least at first. So this gives you a 95% margin, sort of like in other statistics land. We want to be alpha 0.05. Probability that fluctuations that you'll see based on the variance in your data would create points out here in your autocorrelation plot. So this is the 95% window over which if you see data points above that, it's unlikely that that was created just by random mechanics. So over here, it extended outside of this 0.95 margin. Maybe it's real, maybe it's not. A little bit confusing in these early points because this is such a broad-looking curve. But it's much more clear out here where we saw this peak at 52 weeks out, showing seasonality. The peaks out here and this trough down here are well outside of that margin, which tells me that there's something very believably real happening there, which is consistent, of course, with what we saw here. Despite all of these continued sales that kept happening in 2012, you'll see the seasonality very consistent across all of those data points. So, what I'm saying is, I was allotted 4 hours for this. I actually took 5.5. Why? Because, as I mentioned, there were some things in there that I straight up just forgot how to do it in that time, or I didn't actually know because I never worked with Excel spreadsheets. But if I were to do this exact same thing now, with slightly different data, with slightly different questions, I could easily do it in under 4 hours. No problem. Okay, so another thing you want to do is very likely, if you create a presentation for them and you give it to them, they'll actually want you to present it. If you get in there, they're probably going to want you to talk it through slide by slide. Happens to me every time. I mean, I've only been through like 5 interview processes like this, but yeah, they will want you to actually walk this through. And I'm confident, having seen all of you give your capstone presentations, you can do this. Just don't slack on it, is all I'm asking. Make sure that as you walk through the presentation, it tells a clear enough narrative that answers the questions, but also that you say it in words that make sense to a human. I know you'll be tired. You'll have gone through a bunch of other possible interviews with other people earlier in the day. So make this presentation as easy to deliver for you as possible. So things like, okay, ask people if they understood it or if they have advice. It's actually really cool. These are opportunities to learn from other people in the industry, in data science. So often I've gotten tips during interviews based on my take home. Like, hey, here's a different way that you could try to present this. Or here's a different way that you can frame this. It's pretty neat. Even if you can't get a technical audience, you'll get great feedback from the non-technical people. And I did get that too. I often got things like, can you make sure that your visuals pop a little bit more in this way? Can you make sure that when you're talking about this, that you talk about it with these specific business insights and focus a little bit less on like the little details that went into your model? People will trust after a certain point that you're a real data scientist, so you don't have to keep proving it to them over and over again. You probably wouldn't have gotten this far if they didn't already look at something that you've done and say, this person's pretty good. Yeah, weak spots in your presentation. There's going to be some. Often if you're applying for a job that's outside of your domain. But for the most part, if you look like you are, or if you're overly defending the weakest parts of your presentation, you'll likely look a little bit off of them. It's going to be a red flag. Oftentimes, that's what they're really looking for. They're going to be surrounded by a bunch of other people, less than your skill level, maybe some above it. Honestly, I'm so proud of the students here at Galvanize. I'm always frustrated whenever people go out into the world and try to assume that any of the other candidates are at your level. Often they're not. But you don't want to give them reasons to say you're probably not. That's their job. They're actively looking for reasons to either hire you because they really love you, or often another person in that same team will be looking for reasons to get rid of you. Because anything that looks like a red flag is often enough for them to go, person's skilled, qualified, smart, competent. But notice this one little thing tells me they're going to not be a good team player. So a much more useful tip that I like to recommend is, well, that's something that I have improved with more time, or if they ask you a question and you don't know it, what do you say? I don't know. Honestly, it's always better to be honest and say, if you can't answer that question, say, I don't know. Maybe I can look that up. Here's my current best informed opinion, but I don't know. And you know what? People will trust you more if you can do that. These sorts of take-homes, while fun, will be constantly pushing you to more of that discomfort zone. So be okay. Learn to be a little bit okay with saying things like, I'm not a senior data scientist yet. Not in those words, but let's be like, I'm growing into that role. With regard to show your good work, like I mentioned, I made for that take home that I showed you about 24 images. I only used 6. Be smart. Don't try to show everything that you've done. Or just like when you were a kid and you realized your parents don't know everything that's going on in your head. These people don't know, and they actually don't care about everything. So show them only the key insights, only the most important bits of data, only the most important plots that are relevant to the take-home. The other stuff was helpful for you during the process. This is the presentation. And often, I always assume that I need to share code. I always assume that. For me, that's best practice. The reason for that is, again, it continually forces me to raise the standard of my code, but also comments. I love adding comments to my code. Why? Because I want to be able to tell the same story with my code that I told in my presentation. So I included all of the answers. I included, I think in this one, some more discussion within, I think I created new functions. But definitely line by line, you can see when I would have clear answers, or when I would distinctly make a print statement that would utilize the value that I got from my code. Yes?
Should we have iPad notebook, or should we have a specific classes for people?
Yeah, I'm going to say yes. Yes, yes to everything. What I actually mean is, whatever is your preferred method, assuming they don't specifically say we don't like IPython notebooks. Some companies are still like that, not all. But no matter which way you present your code, make sure that it can work, run from top to bottom. If you cannot run that code from top to bottom, they will see that as a red flag. Yes?
So we saying that more people are saying GPU notebooks, it just means that they want to see your code and visualization at the same time.
Yeah, and it saves you time because now your presentation is more like contained within the code too. Yeah, which is why a lot of companies have moved towards that as a viable way to show. Also because so many boot camps teach people IPython notebook, they're just like, okay, we can't get rid of IPython notebooks, let's just make sure the standards are applied. Yeah.
GPU Doctorize?
Sorry?
So like, should we like doctorize what?
Doctorize, so like go through and annotate and change it up? Yes.
No, like, but like, say like a Docker or like a virtual.
Oh, like a Pepe Docker or something?
Yeah.
I mean,
So make sure the quality.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I would actually go through and use some sort of, so like Visual Studio Code does that pretty natively, but yes, anything that helps make sure that the code is actually properly formatted. Syntax is solid, you don't have missing parentheses anywhere. Yeah. That said, some companies will not be specifically looking for the code, so you doing this extra work was mostly for your own best practices. But I always assume, regardless of what they stated, that someone on that team is already a data scientist or at least data science adjacent and will probably want to look at this code. Okay, so some things that maybe aren't mission critical during a take-home, but are best practices, and the sooner you get them, the better. At the top is this DRY acronym. Has anyone here heard of DRY as an acronym before? Hamilton?
Do not repeat.
Do not repeat yourself. Yes, I was going to see if people could figure it out without it, but that's fine. Do not repeat yourself. So I've had students in this cohort who very much recognize immediately, like, oh, I keep repeating these lines in my scripts. I need to figure out a way, is there a way that I can reduce that down so it doesn't look like I'm just repeating the same stuff? Absolutely. You want to have best practices around writing your functions. That way you're not consistently writing the same lines of code for very similar looking functions. Maybe just some little tweaks with keyword arguments that can change how the function works, but still keeps all that same code. That is a weaker, it's not a red flag, it's like a yellow flag. Because yet again, they know that you're in a time crunch, but you're going to be in a time crunch when you're on the job too. So best practices also include not just like linter for like proper formatting to make sure your lines of code don't stretch past 88 characters and things like that. Really, this is a key one. Try to improve the way you write code so that way it doesn't look extra long, verbose, and repetitive. It helps make it also easier to look at too. If you did some research on the domain outside of your parameters on the take-home, be clear about that. Mention it. This is the time where you might be able to argue for, I took an extra 1 or 2 hours before I started the take-home to look up this stuff. And yeah, you may not be able to spend a lot of time on it, but demonstrating that enthusiasm for the goals of the company as well as maybe even the take-home itself is going to help a lot because that is part of the presentation. You are selling yourself here, and you're selling your enthusiasm for potentially joining the their team. So if anything, I know if I were hiring and somebody said, before I started the TakeHome, I looked into your company, and I looked at this, and I was looking at a little bit more about the kind of data you wanted me to look at. And I figured out this, this, and this, which were not obvious to someone like me who's outside the domain. I would love that. That sort of stuff means to me that you're aware of time constraints, but you care. Care so much that you're willing to go a little bit further. And not in a way that's like exploiting yourself to try to like be more valuable if necessary to the company. Maybe that is how it feels. But in a way that tells them that you care enough to go top to bottom and finish the job. And this is just practice. Don't let the nerves of presenting a big piece of work detract from your personality. You'll often see me doing things like spinning around in circles when I'm giving lectures and having my hair down for some reason. No, but really though, what I'm getting at here is company fit is something that James might have talked about with you. And it might be something that ends up being really critical for your success at the company. If you are giving your best professional self, which I almost always recommend, solid. But whatever that version is, make sure it still feels right to you. You're presenting the kind of person that you would like to be for that role among people that you hope mesh well with you. And giving off a little bit more about who you are, the kinds of things that you enjoy doing about that work. Sometimes it means you might not actually be a good fit for the job, and that's okay. Maybe you wouldn't have actually wanted to work there. You would have been qualified, but it would have been a bad fit, and it would have made the job a lot harder. Other times, they'll see certain things about you, about your characteristics, about the way maybe you're enthused about certain aspects of data science, maybe certain things about the company. And those will be cues to them to be like, this person will be a solid culture fit for us. You know how we always say like networking provides upwards of, actually depending on who you're asking, 50% of your job opportunities? I treat the interview as part of that networking. Absolutely. So, whatever I'm showing here in my presentation is still part of me selling who I am to people who don't know me yet, but could be part of my network. And in fact, the people at this company, I didn't end up getting the role. That's okay, but they're still good colleagues. We still end up sending emails to each other, chatting, and should they come up with another role that would open up, hopefully I'll be able to pass that information along to you. But that said, let's see how we are on time. I finished in 48 minutes. Yeah, feel free to review the same material later. But the primary things that I wanted to focus on, did we do it? Develop a strategy for time boxing. I think we focused a lot on that. Identify deliverables and how to over-deliver. I really do answer the questions that they ask. I have one story related to this that I want to relate. And create a general and flexible strategy for some take-homes. I mentioned deploy the easiest, most explicable models. Take a one step deeper. Make a better model. See if you can explain that. And really have clear insights. I'm not going to name which car company a recent student had an interview with. One of the things that frustrated me here is that in their asks, they never mentioned anything about models. And all of the data that they gave and all the questions that they asked were all things you can answer with basic statistics. So in the past, I said, really do focus on just the deliverables. Don't hedge too hard into I want to be fancy. It turns out, despite the asks, despite the way it was framed, despite the data, they still wanted to see that the student could deploy models. It made me really frustrated because that meant to me that the data scientists at that company weren't actually that good. But also that meant that the student, by virtue of knowing the data better than the data scientist there, didn't get the role because he didn't over-deliver. So if you can, in that time frame, give a little bit more and to see if you can just push that envelope a little bit more. That might be the added value that you need to put you over the top. Okay, that's all I got for you folks. So thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, I'm right here.
I have a question.
Yes, of course.
So, like, I think you can get a lot of practice, but how can you make sure you're getting better?
You're getting better.
Yeah, like, I mean, the only feedback source you can get is like you go present and you hear the feedback from the
No, that's not the only place.
Okay.
You can actually ask them afterward. They won't always answer, but ask them, okay, so you didn't get me, you didn't take me in for the interview. May I ask, what was it in what I presented that was good, and what was it that what I presented that didn't allow me to get to the next stage? Surprisingly enough, you'll often get answers from those people because they're human and they want you to also get a job. It just happens that they might not want you to get a job there. Yes.
I think they don't generally provide feedback.
Not always.
I mean, it's hard for them to
If there's a lot of candidates for a role,
provide
yeah.
feedback to someone they're not interested in. So how would you share feedback?
So here's where I'm going to take advantage of the tragedy of the commons a little bit. Most people don't ask for feedback. Most people will just go, oh, God, well, I didn't get it, whatever. And because of that, often those people who you'd be reaching out to haven't been reached with that question yet. And it might be a good sign because there's like, well, this person's still interested. I know they didn't make it this far. I do want to help them. And that, again, goes back to the networking thing I just mentioned. I strongly believe in that, and that's how I still have so many connections with other companies, whether or not I got a role with them.
There's zero cost to that too. If they're so time-trapped that so many applicants and there's not going to give you feedback, then they're not going to remember that you.
That too, like they might not remember your name at all. They'll just be like, either they give you feedback or they don't. So it doesn't really cost you anything for the ask. You've put so much of yourself already into all of this work. It takes you only a little bit of effort for a little bit more information. Sometimes you'll get it. Yeah, Amy Chan.
I'm pretty sure that this is part of our applications. We're as niche as our state pipeline. But
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious because I'm sure that some companies might say really hard pressed in finding somebody really big with, right?
Mhm.
And so, do company circumstances change the how important certain sections are for others?
Yeah.
Because if that's the case, I think it'd be great for us to focus on certain sections first in case those situations do.
So what I can say about that is when they tell you the time frame over which they expect you to do this work, and they tell you like get this in over this amount of like this period. If they say 2 weeks, chances are they're not desperate for a person. If they say get it to us in 2 days, that tells me one of two things. They're a very like extraordinarily well-greased machine company, or they're desperate for someone fast. So if that's the case, that still doesn't change my overall strategy for handling the take-home versus prepping for, say, the Python interview or something. Assuming it's Python. Could be SQL, could be most likely Python. Some companies don't even have in-person coding interviews, by the way, just be aware. But in general, like a lot of the practice that you'll have for one company will be the same kind of practice you'd want for getting a role at another company. So I wouldn't change too much of my strategy for that. What that would change for me is like how much I laser focus on domain knowledge related to the company. I spend a little bit more time getting to know the individuals I might be interviewing with, getting to know more about the culture there. If I can figure it out beforehand, what their work ethic is like. And those end up being really mission critical, even in some ways. I don't want to say more than your skills. Your skills matter a lot, but you don't want to miss out on all these other parts. All right. So with that, I think that's my last lecture with you folks.
Oh.
I know.